everybody. Welcome to the YW Talks for today. My name is Stephanie Land, and I'm the racial justice intern here at the Y. And I have the honor of introducing today's speaker, Ruth Vanita. Ruth is a professor at the University of Montana and was raised and educated in India and taught at Delhi University for 20 years. During that time, she was active in the women's movement and as founding co-editor of Manushi, did I pronounce that right? India's first nationwide feminist magazine. She's the author of several books, which she has brought today to share with us if you want to check those out afterwards, on gender and sexuality in India and British literature and culture. She divides her time between Missoula and Delhi, where she is closely in touch with the LGBT movements. And today's event is co-sponsored by the AAUW, the American Association of University Women. And there will be time for questions after Ms. Vanita's presentation. And join me in welcoming Ruth.
Oh, it's gone away. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the history and nature of anti-rape campaigns and laws in India since 1980. And then I'll raise some questions about the changes in the law that have taken place there. Let's begin with a couple of statistics that the Delhi Police Force just released very recently. Delhi is the capital city of India, and it has a population of about 25 million. So the police said that up to October 15th, there were 1704 rapes reported, and 3485 cases of sexual molestation reported. And the more interesting to the statistic is that they stated that 9 out of 10 reported rapes are committed by people known to the victim, such as they listed father, father-in-law, cousin, uncle, brother, and brother-in-law. So this is completely, of course, in conformity with worldwide patterns. Most rapes are committed by people known to the victim and not by strangers. But what the interesting point here is that it's worth noting that almost all the rapes that have received very widespread media coverage, national and international, and that have triggered the big public protests are rapes by strangers in public places. Those are the ones that have got the attention, though 9 out of 10 are not of that kind. And I'll provide more statistics later, just comparing different countries. So the current wave of anti-rape protests and campaigns and changes in the law began with the December 2012 gang rape of a girl called Jyoti Singh Pandey. She was a physiotherapist, 23 years old, by 6 strangers. And it was a rape, but it was also a murder. She was tortured to death, basically. But before talking about this case, I want to take a brief look at the history of anti-rape protest in India. I'm only going back to 1980. So there was this major nationwide protests against rape. Now, I never like to say the first, because it's possible that one doesn't remember certain things, but let's say the first that I know of. They took place in 1980, and I could only get hold of one picture. This is a picture outside Parliament. Parliament is there to the right side, and the President's house in the background. And these protests were triggered off by a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decided in 1979 that a young agricultural worker called Mathura, who had said that she was raped by 2 policemen, they decided that rape was not proved. This was an illiterate teenager, about 15 to 16 years old, she didn't know her age, who went to the police station near her village with her boyfriend and the boyfriend's mother and uncle, who were objecting to the relationship. So they went to sort out this problem, and 2 policemen took her to a shed at the back of the police station and raped her. A crowd assembled, a local crowd threatened to burn down the police station. So the rapists were forced to, so they were the only 2 policemen there, so they were forced to register a case against themselves. The lower level court said, the district level court said that sexual intercourse had taken place, but rape had not been proved. It then went to the state high court, and the state high court overturned this ruling and said that it was rape because passive submission is not the same as consent. Okay, they said she may have passively submitted, but that's not consent. And then the Supreme Court, so it took many years to get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reinstated the first verdict, saying there were no marks of violence on her, and she didn't raise an alarm, so that presumes that is consent. Then 4 eminent lawyers, 2 women and 2 men, wrote an open letter of protest to the Supreme Court. The media picked this up and publicized it. And then women's groups organized nationwide and held major protests, especially on International Women's Day, March 8, 1980, which is always a day when rallies take place. And as in 78, 79, I was one of the 2 founders of this magazine called Manushi, on which I worked for 13 years. And it was the first nationwide feminist magazine in India. And I was actually present at the March 8, 1980 protest and spoke there. Now, As a result of these protests, the rape law was changed in 1983, and these were the changes made. Some of the changes. One of the changes was that a woman's statement of non-consent was made a rebuttable presumption, which means that if she says she didn't consent, then you presume she didn't consent and you try to rebut that. The other side may try to rebut it. Second thing they did was created a category called custodial rape, which meant that if a woman is raped in the custody of authority figures like the police, for example, or the prison wardens, for example, then it's a different kind of rape than any other kind. It's called custodial rape. It involves more severe punishment if it's proved. And the important part was it shifts the burden of proof to the accused in the case of custodial rape. You know what the burden of proof is, that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. It shifted that. It sort of makes it like they have to prove their innocence. Instead of you proving their guilt, they have to prove. So you're kind of assuming that they're guilty and you prove that they have to prove that they were innocent. So this, somehow this is not showing the whole image, but anyway. So we can now fast forward to 16 December 2012, and when Jyoti Singh Pandey, that's her picture, was this 23-year-old physiotherapy student. Her name has only been released very recently. According to Indian rape law, you're not supposed to release the rape victim's name. So the media gave her other names like Nirbhaya, fearless, which means fearless, and Damini, which means lightning. She was returning home around 9 p.m. from seeing a movie with her boyfriend, Avindra Pandey, and they got onto this private bus, and they didn't realize that the bus was not really in service. The bus was being used by 6 men who connected with the bus service who were partying on the bus. And these men sort of entrapped these two. They told them the bus was working, asked them to get on the bus, and then they started taunting them and being very aggressive with them, like, how are you related to each other? Why are you out alone so late at night? And when she answered, Jyoti was not meek and mild. She retorted and she replied. They then dragged her to the back of the bus and the whole thing escalated. They beat her very severely. They raped her repeatedly, and her boyfriend tried to intervene. They beat him really severely too on the other side of the bus, and since they were 6, they could overpower them. And one of them was a minor, 17 years old, who actually, according to the boyfriend's report, was the worst, and used iron rods, which happened to be in the bus, to penetrate her and dragged out her intestines. She was really severely injured. Then they beat both of them up, stripped them both, took off all their clothes, and threw them out at a major busy intersection in Delhi. And then they tried to run her over with the bus because she was practically unconscious, and they tried to run over her, and the boyfriend managed to pull her to the side. And by the time she got to the hospital, etc., the injuries to the uterus, the genitals, the intestines, but also all over the body were very severe, and there were several surgeries took place, including removing almost all of her intestines. And then she was flown to Singapore for further treatment along with her family, and she died there on 29 December. But she was conscious. She gave a statement to the police. She talked to her parents and everything. She was able to, and she said that she wanted to live. She was fighting to live. The case was picked up by the media, both the print media and the audiovisual media, and covered almost 24/7. It became it sort of made all other news disappear practically. And huge protests started in Delhi on 21st December, and then spread to all over the country in many cities. And there were literally tens of thousands of people out there. And the pictures don't capture it. This is the police trying to get rid of them by using water sprays and things. So these are the images of the protests, some images of the protests. And you see here schoolgirls protesting. So there were people from all walks of life protesting, and there were these huge protests in the big protest venues, but there were also small spontaneous protests by workers in various corporations and in various institutions, schools, colleges, etc. So there were lots of protests in cities, towns all over the country. And these continued for over a month. In central Delhi, they literally pitched the camp there and just stayed there. Many of the protesters stayed there round the clock. And these went on from December into January 2013. And under this pressure, the police, who are usually very slow about doing anything, the police arrested all the accused within 24 hours. And the case was fast-tracked. And this is another protest by women employees of a corporation operation. The case was fast-tracked. 4 of them were sentenced to death for murder. A juvenile can only be sentenced to maximum 3 years imprisonment, so that's what happened to him. And the 6th one, while he was in jail, hanged himself or was said to hang himself. We don't know. The government reacted immediately. There was discussion in Parliament. The head of the ruling party and the chief minister of Delhi went to the airport to receive her body when it came from Singapore. And the protests actually spread across South Asia. Indians and other countries, for instance, in London, also protested. The response was that many states instituted measures like 24/7 helplines for victims, special committees to track cases of violence, and they're trying to set up fast-track courts, which is a very difficult thing to do in India. One of the main problem with the law, I think, is that the courts have really backlogged and really, really slow in deciding anything. The biggest change, though, was changing the rape law. And this is a woman, Supreme Court lawyer. She's to the left. This is the only picture I could get. She is the architect of, we were in college together. So, and she had drafted a bill on the sexual assault law. And this bill had been languishing for years. She had shown it to me years earlier. It had been languishing for years, but suddenly it was picked up and it was fast-tracked and went through Parliament. Although several changes were made in it. The legislature changed her draft by removing marital rape, by increasing the age of consent to 18, and by removing gender neutrality. She had made the rape law gender neutral, so a man can also rape a man. They made it that only a man can rape a woman. They specified the genders. And they also included death penalty for repeated rape, which she had not included. But among the provisions that she had made, which they did accept, were redefining penetration to include even a slight penetration with any part of the body or any object. Death penalty for repeat offenses that they introduced on their own. And they also defined, the law also defines any demand or request for sexual favors as sexual harassment, punishable with imprisonment up to 3 years. Any cases of physical contact and advances involving unwelcome and explicit sexual overtures, so there's imprisonment up to 1 year, or a demand or request for sexual favors, or making sexually colored remarks. Okay. And the law also states that once a sexual intercourse is proven to have taken place, the woman's statement that she did not consent, unsupported by any other evidence. If she just says she didn't consent and you've proved that sex took place, then that's sufficient to convict the man of rape and send him to prison for a minimum of 7 years. And rape includes even penetration with a finger, even up to half an inch. There's an actual case for which a man is probably going to jail for 7 years for this happening in an elevator. She says it did happen, probably, but he says it happened, but with consent. And it happened in an elevator, so anyway, so it's really interesting. Now, most of these provisions are borrowed from sexual conduct codes in Western countries that are used on campuses and so on. But this kind of code has not yet become a law in Western countries. You know, the idea that if any kind of sex took place and she simply says she didn't consent, then that in itself is sufficient to send him to jail for 7 years. Anyway, after this, now the death penalty provision was the new thing. And after this, 2 men were convicted of gang raping 2 women at separate times in Mumbai. And the new provision says that death penalty can be given for repeating the offense of rape. And actually, these men were sentenced to death. It's under appeal, but they were sentenced to death for raping this woman. She was a photojournalist, and they raped her in a deserted factory in the city. And they raped her twice with an interval of 5 minutes, so it was it's a repeat offense. So they've been sentenced to death. And in India, actually, though the death penalty does exist, it is not often applied. It's supposed to be, the Supreme Court has said it's supposed to be reserved for the rarest of the rare cases, for very extreme cases. So this is interesting that it was applied. Okay, at this point, the media has, international media has kind of projected India as sort of, one said, the rape capital of the world. And so I just wanted to show you some statistics. I wish the thing would show the whole, it won't show. But anyway, this is anything I can do about this. Okay. Anyway, so you see, this is the annual reported rape rate per 100,000 people for 2012. So India is 2, USA is 28.6. I couldn't show it, but South Africa is the highest in the world. It's at the bottom of the screen, which for some reason is not showing. So South Africa is, I think, 114, and Sweden is also very high. Sweden is 66 or something. Yeah? If you can, yeah, please, because the whole bottom of every screen's been cut off. Now, of course, rape is one of the most underreported crimes everywhere in the world, right? But if we look at the statistics in other countries where it's also likely to be underreported, such as Bahrain, they still have a higher rate than India. And even if we guess that rape is more reported in Sweden and in South Africa than it is in India, still that alone doesn't account for the big gap. If you look at the big gap between South Africa and India, that's, I think, too much to account for just by underreporting. India also has a relatively high conviction rate. So these are the conviction rates for some countries, and India has a 24.2 conviction rate, which is close to France's rate and much higher than Sweden or UK. So why is it then that, I think it's okay now. Yeah, it's fine now. Yeah. Now, why is it then that rapes, this Time magazine carried this article saying, why does rape seem worse in India than everywhere else, when the statistics don't suggest that that is the case? And the reason that the article suggests is that it's because of the scale of the protests. The scale of the protests picked up by the national and international media make it seem that, oh, this is something terrible happening here, because otherwise why would there be such large-scale protests? This is an article from a South African magazine. A young woman called Enene was, I may be pronouncing that wrong, was raped and killed in a very similar way to Jyoti, intestines torn out and so on, just 2 months before Jyoti. Jyoti's case occurred in December, and this occurred in September. But have you ever heard of it? I'd never heard of it till I read this. The response in South Africa, there were protests, but they were very small and muted protests in comparison to the Indian protests, so the media never picked it up in the same way. There just haven't been that kind of protests. Now, why are there these such large protests in India? And I think it's because, not because the situation is worse, but because of the power of Indian women's and civil rights groups and movements, which have a very long history dating back to the movement for social reform in the 19th century and to the Gandhi-led independence movement and the communist-led independence movement, and also movements on the Hindu right wing. So in all these groups, in the right wing, in the Communist Party movements, and in the Gandhi-led independence movements, women were and still are very active. So, and in these protests, by the way, it's important to note that the left wing and the right wing were all united on this. Left, right, center, women from all the spectrum on this issue, they were all united. So, though they might have had different, like the right wing would have been in favor of death penalty and the left might not have been, though the left also is divided on that issue, but still. But it's worth noting that certain types of rape create more public outrage. As I said, of course, Jyoti's rape, because it was not just rape, it was torture and murder, naturally aroused a lot of fury. But other rapes that have been widely protested, like this rape of this single mother, and she very bravely came out with her own name and her picture, which most victims don't do, outside a bar in Kolkata. So again, these are rapes of women by strangers in a public place. That's the common feature. But of course, most rape takes place in private places by people known to the victim. The protests are great. These are some protests in Kolkata after that rape of that single woman that I showed you. Protests in Mumbai. Again, the pictures don't suggest the scale of these things. But the dark side to these protests, I think, is, for instance, the demand for the death penalty. The demand for the death penalty was widely made by many people in these protests, just spontaneously there. That's what they painted on the placards. That's what they demanded. And if you read the online comments in newspapers, very large number of people saying, hang them, do the same to them that was done to Jyoti, tear out their intestines, kill them, burn them to death, etc., etc. And this could be explained as just spontaneous anger, but it wasn't just that, because it actually got into the law. Now, when the death penalty got into the law, some feminists did object, but it was very mild. There was no major protest about that. There were no major protests against that law. And the unfortunate thing is that India, which is the world's largest secular democracy, is now in the company of dictatorships and theocracies like Pakistan and Iran in executing people for rape. And I want to compare this to some other laws. Under Indian law, if you blind somebody, if you put out their eyes, and this has happened, if you blind someone or you cut off their hand or their foot, the law it comes under is grievous assault. And the penalty is same as for rape, that is 7 years in prison, up to 7 years imprisonment. But if you repeat the offense of rape, you can get the death penalty now. Whereas if you repeat the offense of grievous assault, you can still get only up to 7 years imprisonment. So theoretically, if you blind somebody and then you take off their other eye, or blind somebody else, or cut off their one leg and then one arm later, you still will get only up to 7 years for each. But if you rape somebody twice, you can get the death penalty. Now, what does that mean? Isn't it, I think, of a hangover about the loss of honor that is involved in rape. Somehow that is seen as much worse. You lose an arm or a leg or an eye. That's not necessarily worse than rape, it depends. But it's seen as worse because in rape you're also losing something else, which is honor, marriageability, whatever. And even the media, the national and international media, have fostered this idea, maybe completely unwittingly, that rape is somehow worse than death, that idea. For example, almost all the reports on the Jyoti Pandey case termed the attackers rapists when they were, it says, 4 rapists arrested, the rapists taken to jail, the rapists sentenced to death. And they were not, they were murderers, you know, and isn't murder worse than rape? But no, they were constantly called rapists in the headlines, not murderers, and they were given the death penalty for murder, because this was under the earlier law. But it seemed from the media as if they were getting the death penalty for rape. Another criticism that has been made of the new law, with which I agree, is that it undermines the basis of law in a democracy, which is that a person is innocent until proven guilty. And the media has a lot to do with this. Indian media is much worse, I think, than the US media in this respect. Basically, media trials take place, and the media consistently refers to the accuser, the complainant, as a victim, and to the right from day one. In other cases, like the case in the elevator, for example, which I don't have time to go into the details, but they referred to her from the beginning as a victim and to him as a rapist. So he was in jail for close to a year before the case even appeared in court, and he was basically tried, and everyone decided that he was guilty. And he's a very famous journalist, who had a left-wing journalist who had a lot of political enemies, and his life career, everything is destroyed. It doesn't really matter what the court comes up with now. Okay, go for sorry. Okay, so I want to, yeah, okay, so the reasons. Okay, so the reason anti-rape protests have created, as I said, this image that India is sort of a horrible place for women to live, and so on. Now, India is a country of 1.25 billion people, about. It's the size of Western Europe geographically. So yes, of course, many women are oppressed, exploited, abused, raped, etc. But many are also loved and respected. India has had a woman prime minister, a woman president, and several very powerful state chief ministers, all of them, almost all of them single women. For instance, this is Jayalalitha, several times chief minister of a major state, Tamil Nadu, and that's her inseparable friend, Shashikala Natarajan, whom she calls her life friend. Mayawati, from a so-called formerly untouchable community, very powerful chief minister of the most popular state in India. She has prime ministerial ambitions. That's Mamata Banerjee, another very powerful chief. And they're all very different types of women with different political inclinations and so on. This is Sushma Swaraj under the current BJP Hindu right-wing party's government. Women have very important cabinet positions, among the most important. She's the Minister of External Affairs. She's the Minister of Education. So it has been said, and more important than that, India produces millions of women doctors, engineers, scientists, professors in all disciplines, businesswomen. It's been said that the face of India's mission to Mars is female, because most of the scientists working on it are women. I was educated almost entirely by women teachers throughout school and college, in women's colleges. And I think Jyoti Pandey, the girl who's also, her case attracted a great deal of outrage because of the story was so typical of upward social mobility in India. It was such a moving story, a story that everybody has in India has kind of encountered in their daily lives. Her father had moved from Delhi to Delhi from his village in order to educate the children. And as you can see in the picture, this is the picture of the village. When he moved to Delhi, he worked as an airport loader, a loader of luggage, doing manual labor at the airport. Both parents were extremely proud of Jyoti, who was the oldest child. And let me see, this is both parents. And yeah, this was a picture of women scientists greeting each other at a conference in 2014. Anyway, so both parents were very proud of Jyoti. She was a very lively, vivacious girl, and she had 2 younger brothers who also adored her. And the family's hopes were pinned on her getting a job. She used to tutor neighborhood children to make extra money on the side to supplement her father's income. So it was a story of upward mobility, powered and fueled by parents' dedication to their children's education, which I think is a very common pattern in India. Everyone is familiar with these stories. And on the bus, she had been to see, that evening, she had been to see an English medium movie. She comes from a non-English speaking background. around, but she had been to see an English medium movie, she was with a boyfriend, she was wearing jeans. So she might have appeared as if she was from a different class than the rapist, but actually she wasn't. They were all migrants from villages in the same state. And the only thing is that they were sort of downwardly mobile. They came from broken up families and really, and they were just really badly behaved. Whereas she came from, in general, not just in this case, and she came from this family that was really working and was upwardly mobile. So but there really wasn't that much difference in the class background. Okay, let me conclude by saying I mentioned that Parliament had refused to make rape gender neutral, which was what the woman lawyer had proposed, the bill had proposed. What this means is that a man who is raped by another man, which is also very frequent, cannot sue for rape. He can only sue for sodomy. And there is a law introduced in India by the British in 1860, under which unnatural sex is punishable with up to 10 years imprisonment. It's more than the law, than the punishment for rape. In 2010, Professor Ramchandra Siras, 64 years old, professor of Marathi and a poet, and had worked at Aligarh Muslim University in North India for over 40 years, and he was just about to retire the same year. He was suspended on grounds of misconduct. A television crew had barged into his house, aided by his students, and filmed him having sex with another man. So LGBT groups and intellectuals protested, went to his aid, and so on, but opinion on the campus was deeply divided. It's a very conservative community, and he was isolated, he was shamed, he was thrown out of his university quarters. And 2 months later, the court ruled, and there weren't any huge protests about this. There were small protests by LGBT groups who worked on it, but it wasn't, anything like that. 2 months later, the court ruled that he should be reinstated. And he spoke to a journalist, and he said earlier he had not used the word gay for himself, but he now was using the word gay for himself. And he said he wanted to work for the gay community in future. And the next day, he was found dead of poisoning. The postmortem showed that he had been poisoned. Now, they just hushed it up as a suicide, but I think it was most probably a murder because the authorities did not know what to do with it, and wanted to get rid of the whole thing. And what the police then did was they repeatedly interrogated his sexual partner, who was a poor rickshaw puller, and they repeatedly interrogated him, beat him up. He was a married man, and they beat him up and interrogated him, trying to make him responsible for the murder. And he was so distraught that 2 months later, he tried to burn himself to death. And his wife saved his life, but he was severely burnt. And then the media just dropped the whole thing, and we don't know what happened next. And there's been very little public outcry about these victims, who are victims in equally in their own way. Last year, the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court, upheld the anti-sodomy law, saying that LGBT people, the case had made its way through many courts, and we've got a positive judgment at the Delhi High Court level, very positive judgment, overturning the law as unconstitutional, saying that it violates the constitutional right to life and liberty and privacy and dignity. But the Supreme Court said that LGBT, now I'm quoting, the LGBT people are a minuscule minority, so their existence is not a solid basis to rule the law unconstitutional, which is a ridiculous argument, because even if it's a minority of one, if this was the only case, that's still enough reason to declare it unconstitutional. Parliament has never discussed this question. The political parties are divided on it, all the political parties, but they stay away from it. They don't want to discuss it. Now, the victims of this law are not commemorated with anything even vaguely approaching the same fervor as a rape victim. And I think perhaps the reason is that the public, even if they sympathize with these victims, they don't see them as innocent, that they are not innocent victims because they were engaging in sex. There's this kind of... similarly, one could compare also the laws regarding sex workers. The sex workers are now unionized in many parts of the country and are demanding legalization, and feminists are very much divided about it. And many feminists feel that, including my own former colleague on that magazine that I edited, feels that sex work should not be legalized. Whereas the women themselves, they're mostly women, there's some men, are demanding legalization. But I want to conclude by saying that many women's organizations, LGBT organizations, and civil rights groups all over the country are working to change attitudes to sexuality. This is a sexuality studies workshop that is held every year to train activists and college teachers and whoever wants to go to this workshop. Is one of the, where these laws and things are discussed, all the laws relating to sexuality across the whole spectrum. And I think it's going to be a long and slow process. So, okay, let me stop.
I'm curious about what the gender makeup of Parliament is and has been in recent years.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to say I don't know. I would guess 10%. women. But that's just a guess. I'd have to look at it. But I'm sure you can Google it easily.
Yeah.
There's an upper and a lower house. And then there's a state legislature. Every state has a legislature. You'd have to look at all those statistics. I should say though on this question that there is a big movement to have a 50% reservation for women in all the legislatures and in parliament. And all the parties sort of pay lip service to this. They don't feel that they can publicly oppose it, so they all say they're for it, but they don't do anything. They don't really push that women's reservation. And in private, a lot of them don't, and some of them don't really want it. And they make arguments like if you have 50% reservation for women, then there'll just be tokenism. Male politicians will just put on their wives and their daughters and so on, which has happened in the past at the lower level. So, but that's the reasoning there. And there's lots of, but it's being debated. It has been debated in Parliament, but it hasn't passed. But yeah, the 50% reservation bill, and they do have reservations for women at the lowest level, village level, district bodies, which are called panchayats, and it's actually worked quite well there. I think they have 25% reservation for women. It's worked quite well at that level. So yeah.
So if the media was talking about these sexual assaults, how is it that the elected officials could avoid having to weigh in or discuss this at all? How? Because I mean, certainly it was a feeding frenzy by the media.
The rape?
Yeah.
Oh no, they did discuss it. I said that. I may have not dwelt on it enough. Parliament just took it up immediately and discussed it and passed the law. That's how the law was changed. That was passed in Parliament. Parliament passed the law very fast, the law that had been languishing for years. After the 2012-2013 protests against this, after this case, one of the main things they did was to pass the law. And that has been Indian government's way of dealing with all problems. And I think one of the weaknesses of the women's movement has been to always demand a change in law and be satisfied with that. Whereas, of course, the implementation of the law is a whole different business. So just having more and more punitive laws doesn't really achieve, I think, much. But that's what the government always does, so that they can say, we've done it, we've done this. And so that's what they did. They discussed it in Parliament almost immediately at the next session, and they passed the law and made the law much more punitive. They introduced this death penalty, they introduced the virtually shifting the burden of consent proof and so on. So they did.
Well, my follow-up is then what is the implementation? Is there a group that monitors it? Is there a addressing of issues of training of law enforcement?
Yeah, like I said, different states, that's at the state level, so different states have done different things. The government does have a crime against women police. They've had it for a while now. Police cell, that's called the Crimes Against Women cell, which they do, and this varies among different states, a push to have more police women, for example. But I think the main problem really is, there's several problems. One of the problems is that people are generally afraid of the police and do not trust the police for good reason, and therefore won't really go unless it's extremely severe. Many people will just postpone, even for things like minor robberies and so on. You'd rather not report it to the police. There's no point, is the general sort of feeling. And the more important problem is that when it gets to the courts, from the police, when it gets to the courts are so backlogged that the simplest case takes years and years, even if it's totally uncontested. I can give an example from my own family. If you try to get a will probated and there's no contest, nobody is opposing it, it still takes years and years in court just because of the way the courts function, how inefficient they are, and how slow they are, and how backlogged they are, and so on. So that's another problem. So Mathura's case, for example, the first case I talked about, the agricultural laborer, she was 15 or 16 when the rape took place, and she was in her mid-20s and had been completely lost sight of. Nobody knew where she was. They tracked her down, the journalists, and found that she was married, living somewhere. By the time the case actually went to the Supreme Court, so she was like out of the picture. Lawyers were still fighting, so yeah.
So, as you said, we're talking about stranger rape here for the most part, but the majority of rapes are someone you know, often someone in a family. When I was in Thailand last year on that exchange to the Mansfield Center, and meeting with women attorneys and sexual assault groups, it was interesting that they tended to divide in the law up the issue as those that were under family law, that were sexual assaults or battering that had to do with internal family, were handled in a different way than the external
legally
ones were.
Or extra-legally?
Yes.
Really? No, that's not the case.
And they often recommended family therapy, and to keep the family together was the priority here. So that's how they handled it.
Okay.
What's going on with
No,
how
the
we
rape
handle
law
it
doesn't make any such distinction, and I know many cases do come to women's organizations of daughters having been raped by fathers and running away, or any other relative in the family, and come away, and then the women's organizations try to provide them shelter. That the government-run shelters are not safe and are not good. So the women's organizations with very little resources try to provide shelter to these women on an individual basis and fight the case at the lower levels. But those cases have gone to court, some of them, but none of them have made this kind of a splash. They've never reached the Supreme Court. They have never picked up by the media in this way. They have never triggered these kind of huge protests, even though many of them are very gruesome and quite even rapes of little girls and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So they do come into the media, but they don't get this kind of attention that this case got. Yeah.
It's my impression that the juvenile justice system in India is quite progressive and treats juveniles in a way that our country could learn a lot from. So was there an outcry that the 17-year-old wasn't tried as an adult?
Yes, there was a huge outcry because, of course, he, in India, many people of that age are married, are working, etc. So the notion of them, they don't seem like a child. And he was very active in the whole thing and was apparently one of the most vicious. So his getting away with 3 years in prison, after that he'll be out on the streets again. Yes, there was a great deal of outrage, but nothing could be, including from her parents. Her parents, by the way, demanded the death penalty for all of them. And but the law was the law, so that couldn't be changed. And so, so that is very debatable, what you're calling a progressive, which some people would agree with, other people don't agree with at all. And so that's being debated. But yeah, that's how it is.
Is there a difference between the number of reports from the small villages as opposed to the major cities?
Yes, yeah, I'm not sure. Again, I'm just now from my impression, rather I haven't looked at the statistics, is that yes, the more reports and more cases actually going to court from the cities. Though that first 1980 case was interesting because it was from a village. It was unusual because it was a village case which made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and largely because women picked it up. And there are many such rape cases in villages, but they don't usually get, they come into the media, but they don't get the attention that particular case got. And it's hard to say, as it always is, why one case gets more attention than another one that might occur the next day. But yeah, that's true, that in the cities it's more reported than in villages.
Could you say some more about the sexual harassment part of the new law, and if that's, if any cases have been actually brought forth, or if any changes happened because of that part?
As far as I'm very critical of that part of the law. I find that, for instance, saying that any welcome or any unwelcome sexual advance, how do you know that advance is unwelcome until you've made it? And if we just look back at our own lives, I'm sure we all realize that. So if we were going to strictly implement that, practically the whole country would be in jail. Any unwelcome sexual advance. And a sexual advance could be any sexually colored language. So you tell someone they're looking nice, that could be sexually colored language, depending on how you interpret it. Or you tell someone, it could go from anywhere to saying you have nice legs to, oh, you're looking great today, or anything that's sexually colored. You can get into prison for a year. That's ridiculous. But these are so I'm very wary of that. It will be interesting when the test case comes for those cases. So far, nothing has come up for those. The only one that did come is that famous elevator case where he was her employer. This left-wing, very, very famous journalist with a lot of enemies, as I said, was in the elevator with this girl, and apparently there'd been some flirtation. He says flirtation. She says what amounts to harassment. But she had never reported it before. And in this conference, they were in an elevator in a 2-story building. The building had only 2 stories. They were in an elevator, and she says that he pulled down her panties, manually penetrated her with one finger. And there's a video camera outside the elevator which shows her coming out, adjusting her hair, but there isn't a video camera in the elevator. And also, of course, there's a limit to how much you can keep the elevator going and the doors closed when it's a 2-story building, right? So, but everybody, the whole media jumped on him, as I said, and dubbed him a rapist. And he may well be, I don't know, but he was in jail for months and months. And so that was the case of the new law. This is under the new law, where penetration, and where if if he admitted that took place. Now, if you admit that took place and it only goes on consent, it's he said, she said, then the new law says that if she said it, then he has to disprove it, which is almost impossible to disprove, right? That there was consent or there wasn't consent. So that's the test case now. It hasn't yet been settled in court, but it'll be a brave judge who decides to acquit him. You know, the amount of media frenzy on that story was even more, I think, than there weren't these public protests for that story at all. But the media frenzy was equal because this man was so well known. The man was so well known. And he had run an independent sort of left-wing paper which had performed sting operations on corruption and things of very powerful people. So he made some very powerful enemies in high places. Now that doesn't mean that the girl is a liar. I mean, I don't want to jump to that conclusion. But you know, what happens, how the thing escalates depends on a number of factors beyond what just happened. So, yeah.
Do you think that attitudes are changing at all in terms of
Toward
like I was thinking of young boys growing up to be more respectful and understand consent as they grow older and that kind of thing, respect for women?
See, in a country of 1.2 billion people, it's very hard to say because there are such wide differences. There's such wide differences in terms of class, in terms of urban and rural, in terms of just family culture, in terms of region, because different regions of the country have very different attitudes to women. For example, in the north, many parts of the north, women are much more supposed to be restricted, and especially in the rural north, they're supposed to stay at home. And you can see it even in things like covering the head. Many more women in the north cover the head. In the south, it's considered inauspicious to cover the head. So when you get married, for example, in the wedding ceremony in the north, the head is traditionally covered, and in the south, it's not. It's considered inauspicious to cover the head. So that's just symbolic, but I mean, it shows you something. So son preference, for example, preferring sons over daughters is much stronger in the north, though it's spreading to the south, but it's much stronger in the north. So the regional divides, there are all kinds of differences. So in these protests, for example, a lot of men came out to protest. There were very large numbers of men in the protests. They were very mixed. On the other hand, when you look at statements that politicians made, so there was the whole range of statements from politicians, the very supportive ones, to completely ridiculous ones which said that which kind of said what the rapist mother said. And the rapist mother saying it is one thing, but for politicians to say things like, why was she out so late alone at night and with another man to whom she was not married, and things like that, you know. So you have the whole range of opinion and yeah.
Could you just tell us how you came to Montana?
Well, that answers my question. How are we so lucky that you are here?
I was young and foolish. I guess I think it has to do with being gay. If I hadn't been gay, I don't think I would have. I thought that I would have a better chance at a relationship and a more open community in the West, and which is actually what Professor Siras also said. He said he wanted to migrate to America because that is the only place where he can be freely gay. That's what he said. So I applied for a job. I got this job, and I took it. I'm not sure it was the right thing to do, but yeah, that yeah.
You raised the issue of custodial rape, and so the issue to that really is there are conditions under which there just is a categorical denial of an ability to consent. And I don't know how far it goes there, certainly in this country. If you're incapacitated for any reason, if you're a minor, if you were drunk, if you're passed out, etc., those are by definition conditions under which the person cannot give consent.
Okay.
Are there additional ones besides?
No, minors.
And is alcohol a major issue there as it is here?
No, most women are not drinking in public, at least. I mean,
men drinking too.
Men drinking, but then his being incapacitated is not an excuse, right?
No.
So, but in here it seems to be that if the woman was drunk, she can't give consent. But that perhaps that's an issue, but it's not. The culture of drinking is not the same as it is here, especially for women. There are women who drink, but it's not at all on the same scale as here, especially in public places. So I think that issue hasn't really come up in the same way. But minors, yes, and that age of consent is a very interesting issue because Kirti, who drafted the law, had kept the age of consent as 16, and the state raised it to 18. And there's a problem with raising it to 18. It might sound like it's good because you're protecting more women, but actually the problem is that if a 17-year-old girl runs off with an 18-year-old boy, which happens frequently, runs off to get married with, then he can be accused of raping her because she's a minor and he's not. So, and that happens frequently. Parents are very anxious to prove that their daughters are minors, so that will give them an excuse to drag her back home. So, and Kirti, being a woman lawyer who deals with women's cases, has had lots of such cases. So she felt that a woman at 17 has the ability to consent, and she shouldn't assume that she's a minor and therefore she can't consent. So, because it can be used against her in many cases. So, yes, being a minor, but custodial rape is more institutional in India. It applies to situations where women are in an institution, and in that institution they are in the control of men who are in power in that institution. So it would apply to prisons, to patients in hospital, prisons, police stations for sure, because that's where it came from. It came from the Mathura rape case, and lots of police men, get this control, and they can. So the law was made that when a woman is arrested, a policewoman always has to be present, which is, I don't think that law is really implemented because many police stations don't have policewomen. So, but that law was made. So
That was one of the first laws made in Montana in 1919 was to put women matrons in the jails. Exactly.
Right, but
for that
at
reason.
every arrest, the policewoman has to be present. So, so yes, police stations, prisons, orphanages, women's rescue homes, suppose homes where women have been put to rescue them from bad situations, women's government-run ones. They're, all such ones. Custodial.
The statute, as you had it up there, also mentioned marital rape. We changed that. Montana was about 86. But there were legislators who sat on that committee, since it was on the bill, who jokingly leaned over and said, I raped my wife last night. So we created a situation where we do not categorically say that if you're married, that is by definition consent.
Right, it's a very
for
tricky
sex.
one. Yeah.
So what's the situation?
Well, in the law as she originally drafted it, she had marital rape as rape. But when Parliament passed the bill, they removed that. So marital rape is not rape.
So if you're married, you're by category giving consent to rape.
Yes, and there are some ambiguous cases where if you're married but you're separated, you're living in separate residences, and you're like on the track to divorce, you can demonstrate that you were not getting along, you were separate, and then he comes into the house and has sex with you, then that case might qualify. But if you were living together and you were, there's no evidence that you were on the outs, as it were, then no, that doesn't, unless there's evidence of violence and so on, but then it would come on domestic violence. It won't come under rape as such. If he beat you up, etc., then that would be a different thing. But otherwise, marital rape, I don't know, it's not a recognized. Yeah.
Are there any men movements? Because the law seems to be so discriminatory toward men. Are there any men movements to change it?
Yeah, there are a lot of. I don't. There are a lot of men who are very active in civil liberties groups, and there's a really sad case of it. How did I say that? There's this man who spent his whole life working in a civil liberties group, Muslim man working in a civil liberties group and working for women's issues and so on, and again had political enemies, and then he was accused by this young woman who, now by his story, she insisted on staying over the night. He thinks it was a setup, and she stayed over and then accused him of having I think raped her, or at least made sense. I think raped her, but anyway, again, she didn't file a case, she didn't go to the police, she just gave it to the media. It was all over the media, he felt his life was destroyed and he committed suicide. So it never went to the police or to court or anything. But yes, there are lots of men working in civil liberties groups in villages too, in towns, and of course in the LGBT movement. But the men's groups as such, there are one or two men's groups, and they are groups who are supposed to be defending men against all this stuff. So they are very sort of crazy groups, and very small, but crazy groups, and you see them writing on the internet about how men are being persecuted under these laws. So that's kind of a fringe movement. Yeah.
What about the sports issue? I think, soccer, football is a big Indian sport, but it does seem to me that certainly in Western culture, there is some connection between our gladiator sports culture and the permission to celebrate victories with sexual assaults. Is there any you know, I mean, I don't think it's even factually true, but that there are more sexual assaults and battering going on after the Super Bowl, et cetera, or, I won't even go to the University of Montana situation, but is there any similar connection between you know, a hyper male sports culture in India and sexual assault or battering?
Not as, it hasn't, if it is, it hasn't come out at all. And I must say that the culture is very different. Till I came to the US, I had been on a major campus and visited many other, and never heard of any sport being so big on campus. We used to go watch cricket games at Delhi University, but we didn't, it was never, there were no such cricket or football heroes on campus. There was no such thing. That culture just didn't exist on campuses. And I hope it doesn't. It never was. So there are the national level and state level players who are adulated. But
So it's
no,
very
I've never
difficult
come
to see
across
our own
this kind of
culture,
connection.
and you're being an outsider. What is your observation of our culture? Well, we're asking you questions about your culture, but oftentimes I think it's very helpful to have, you know, we say it's hard to see your own culture,
Right.
you know. So, but you're here as an educated observer of culture in many ways. So what are your observations of our culture around sexual assault?
I don't know, it's a vast topic. I would have to get more specific. I think it's just very different because, for one thing, there's a great deal of pressure to have sex before marriage, right? And I see that with my students. And there's one student who had taken a vow to be a celibate or whatever, and instead of keeping it to himself, he couldn't help talking about it in every single class, which means that it was such a big issue. Whereas in India, I think the majority of students are celibate, or if they're not, they're hiding it, and for various reasons. But there just isn't that to the same degree. I'm sure there is pressure to date and so on in the big cities now, but there isn't to the same degree the pressure to have sex. It's not considered normal. It's considered perfectly normal not to, let's say. Whereas here, even very young kids are, there's the whole dating, and that is because marriage is arranged in a different way. If you have to arrange your own marriage, then you have to do certain things, whereas in India most people are going to have their families arrange it, so they don't feel that pressure to date, etc., and go in that direction. So that creates a whole different, the whole date rape thing, etc., which I'm sure happens in India too, but not on the same scale. For another thing, of course, is that in India, when you do date, and of course people do date, the opportunities for privacy are very few and far between. Because most people, and this is a huge difference, most people live with their families till they get married. If you move out of your family, the only reason you would move out of your parents' home is if you are working in another city. If you're working in the same city and you move out of your parents' home, everyone presumes you don't get along at all. Then there's some huge problem in the family. Whereas here, it's sort of normal for people to move out when they're 18, right? And so that's a big difference, because if you're dating, you would have to bring the person home, and you may not be ready to bring them home and introduce them. There's no other place to be private. You have to go to a restaurant, and if you go into a public place, then the police will catch you for public indecency or whatever. So actually the opportunities for privacy are very restricted, and it's a much more crowded place. Of course, here you can go 5 minutes and you'll be in a forest. That's not the case, right? If you're in a forest, somebody will pop up from behind a rock. You can never be, you literally can never be alone in a landscape, almost never. You'd have to go to like the extreme remote areas of Himalayas to be alone. So the situation is just very different. And if you bring a date home, which people do now, and then you're in a room and your parents and siblings are all next door, so it will be difficult for him to rape you, right? Because they'll hear what is going on. So people don't have a great deal of privacy. Most people, in fact, are sleeping in the same room with a lot of other people even after they get married and even until they get married. So it just is very different.
I can't remember the name of the journal.
Manushi. Yeah.
How's that doing? Whatever.
It ran for about over 20 years, and then it went on to just becoming an online journal instead of a print journal. After I left after 13 years, and the other woman who was running it, she just got involved in a whole lot of other things, politics of different, other kind of politics of street people and street vendors, and who are mostly men, a lot of them are men. So she kind of moved away from that, the women's focus of the magazine. But it played a very, I think, catalytic role at a certain time in the 80s. It brought, at the time when we started it, women's issues were not written about in the mainstream media. There was a ladies' page which was mostly recipes and fashion and stuff like that. But I think the women's movement of which Manushi was a part made the women's issue a political issue, so that now you can, like every newspaper seriously covers women's issues, and the same people who couldn't find a forum and who would write for Manushi now can write for any newspaper. So I think the role that Manushi played is over, because now they can write anywhere. Maybe
You know, I think part of the reason it's interesting to hear about what's going on in India and other cultures is to get outside of our own heads a little bit, because if you look at these statistics and all, yes, we can have better laws and we can prosecute more people and throw people in jail, etc. But is sexual assault somehow innate to primates, or at least to human beings? And if so, how do you prevent it or reduce the incidence of it across cultures? What role besides just after the fact prosecution of cases is important if we're going to in fact try to reduce it to, you know, the lowest level it could possibly be? And how does a culture as a whole give permission for sexual assault as opposed to sexuality, and how are those two related? So I mean, I think that's what I'm grasping for. I mean, I'm tired of just prosecuting rapists. I mean, that's not getting us anywhere. I mean, really, the incidence of sexual assault is still just totally unacceptable in this culture at the highest level, and still I think has a large degree of cultural permission.
Well, though it varies country to country, like in South Africa, for instance, they did surveys which showed, you must have read these, where the majority of men in several African countries said that rape was all right. They actually endure. Now, I think in some other cultures, men may think it's all right, but they won't feel that they can say it. So the ability to, that's important, when you think you can say it and that it's fine. So as I said, in India, the politicians, whatever they may think, in public they feel compelled to support certain things. So I think it's
in
important
Montana,
that you
in the legislature, they don't say that anymore. And they used to say it all the time.
So that's a change.
And to take that to the other side, mind you, men have got to be the ones who've got to figure out how to stop a lot of sexual assault. Women can do so much of it. On the other part, men have got to decide it's not okay, and they've got to be the ones to teach each other and hold each other in line to not do it. I mean,
When
we're
you have,
working over
when you
here on
have
the
an
side.
individualized society which has a lot of privacy and a lot of individualism and extreme individualism and a lot of privacy available, it's hard for anyone to exert pressure. I mean, you don't know what's going on in the next door house. In India, you do, just because there's no space, and you hear everything spills onto the streets, especially for the poor. And even for the middle class, there's a lot of gossip in the neighborhood, and you know what's. Whereas here, it's not the case. You're leading your own life, and you literally you have a vague idea, but you don't really know what's going on next door. So it's hard to say that men should put pressure. I mean, in certain situations, yes, like after a football game, men are there. But otherwise, what you're doing at home, who knows what you're doing? And most rapes are happening in private, so I'm not sure that works. Yeah.
I learned about a year ago about an outfit called the Date Safe Project. And it educates people on prevention and intervention. And trains people, it's a whole shift. It's a shift from no consent to consent each step of the way.
Yeah, that's what the California law is.
Yeah, that's the California
law.
model. And to some degree, part of that's in the new, at least the campus procedures of how
Yeah.
to.
And this is an outfit that trains high school students, parents, military people, college people in promoting ask permission at every step. And get it. Don't do it if you don't get permission. And it's called the DateSafeProject.com or .org.
And that wouldn't do anything at all to the fact that most, all, let's say, sexual assault in families, they're not interested in asking consent.
Yeah,
You know.
but if they get it in school, it eventually gets. Yeah.
I don't know that these things can be taught. I mean, this is my general view about teaching anything. I don't think things are learned by just telling, even to a child. I think it's done by the emotional, like one of the rapists, the minor, for example, the 17-year-old, at the age of 8, he was sent from he had a broken family with several siblings in extreme poverty. He was sent at the age, I'm not saying this is an excuse, but he was sent at the age of 8 to Delhi and worked in various situations. He may have been raped, who knows, he worked in various situations, very bad situations, and was kind of always hovering on the edge of destitution. But more important than destitution, because there are a lot of poor people who don't do things like this, is the sort of emotional brutalization.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's what really makes up a person, is the emotional makeup, the kind of, and maybe even be set in the first 5 to 7 years.
Well,
I don't think it happens by telling you should do this and you shouldn't do that. I think it happens
yeah,
by...
this is actually a conversation to shift the culture.
Mhm.
So there's many places to shift the culture.
Yes.
Look at the media's presentation of sexual assault. I still think it's a culture that largely finds it titillating and acceptable
Yeah,
in various ways. I mean, it's everywhere.
And this outfit's been very, very successful for a number of years.
But thank you
In
for
training.
telling us about India. It's very interesting to hear it. Appreciate it.
There was one slide there and the sign said, don't tell your girls not to go out, tell your boys to
Right.
behave themselves.
Yeah. Because usually parents tell their daughters to be careful, not go out.
Right.
Sons, they'll be okay.
Boys will be boys, or say wild oats. Yes.
Well, they prefer sons to also
Yeah.
come home in the evening, but if sons come home late,
Yeah.
they don't get the same degree of lack
Yeah.
that daughters.
I just wanted to thank Ruth for sharing her expertise today, and thank you all for being here and joining in on the discussion. And this is part of a monthly series that we have here at the Y. Next month will be Professor Anya Jabor on Friday, December 12th at noon, and she will present the Montana Women Making History, biographical sketches of some of Montana's most significant women reformers. And to keep you informed, we have a sign-up sheet on the table over there. And also we ask if you have any ideas on topics that you'd like to speak about. Amanda Opitz, who is our communications coordinator, has left her business card on the table over there. So you can grab that and maybe shoot her some ideas on future discussions. And thank you for Ruth to coming
Thanks.
today and speaking with us.